Friends, welcome to Zealots at the Gate, a Comment original podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Send us an email with feedback, questions at zealots@comment.org, and make sure you tag us on social media. I'm Matthew Kamek.
And I'm Shadi Hamid. Matt and I are good friends, but maybe you wouldn't expect that. Matt's Christian, I'm Muslim. Matt's conservative, I'm sort of liberal. Matt's white, I'm brown. Also, Matt's a theologian, I'm a political scientist.
Together we research religion, politics, and the future of democracy at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Today, we have a very special guest, Laura Field, who is a scholar in residence at American University and is the author of a fascinating new book, which is getting a lot of attention. It's called Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. And that's what we'll be talking about today, the intellectuals who have formed Trumpism and trying to understand what Trumpism really means and represents from an intellectual standpoint. And that's not how we usually think about Trumpism. We think about it as something very instinctive and visceral and Trump just doing whatever he feels like in the moment. But there are thinkers behind what he stands for and who are articulating a vision of what's to come. And, perhaps some of it's frightening. We'll talk about that. Maybe, Laura, just to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about your own background and biography, because you moved in these new right, let's say conservative circles for a while earlier in your career, and you got to know some of those figures, or at least saw them up close, and you also studied with leading conservative figures in your graduate work. But then you left conservatism, or I guess you weren't really ever fully a part of it, but you moved away from those circles over time, and you had a kind of definitive break where you thought to yourself, I don't really want to be in this environment so much anymore. So maybe just tell us a little bit about how all of that evolved.
Sure. So my background is in conservative academia, and the book is about the intellectual slice of the conservative movement. So it's kind of different, but they butt up against each other. And so I studied political philosophy with these Straussians in Edmonton. I sort of fell in love with the great books tradition when I was an undergraduate student. And Straussians are these followers of Leo Strauss, who's this quite wonderful sort of conservative philosopher, but he never identified as a conservative. He's a wonderful commentator on ancient books and does all these close readings on Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. And so I fell in love with that tradition, and then I did my graduate work in Texas. Again, my professors were quite conservative. But I was never very conservative myself. As you noted, I was kind of caught up in the books and the ideas, and I still love that stuff. But I also studied public law in Texas, and that's when I started to get a little disenchanted with sort of the social dynamics of the world I was in, and also just the way of thinking. It was just not historically grounded enough, and so that just informed my drift a little bit. I finished in Texas. I did my PhD. I mean, to just give you a sense of how apolitical I was, because I wasn't involved in movement conservatism or really any other politics. My dissertation was on Rousseau and Nietzsche and the autobiographical rhetoric of the self, right? So this is kind of where my mind was. And I mean, it's political in a way. I can make the argument, but it's also not. So, but if you fast forward to 2016, I was teaching at American University, and I was pretty scandalized when Trump got elected. And I was also just at a point in my career where I wanted to sort of do more public-facing writing and do something different. So, and I was shocked when I saw that Michael Anton and some of these people at the Claremont Institute that I talk about in the book, he was the sort of first guy to write anything defending Trump from an intellectual perspective, called the Flight 93 election, which people might be familiar with. And that got read on Rush Limbaugh. And I had applied to Claremont Graduate University for grad school, and I didn't want to go because I knew it was not my scene. I knew it was very political. I was shocked to read the Michael Anton thing and pretty repulsed. But I thought, well, this is something I could write about. This is something I could be, I have something to say about. And so I started watching that world much more closely.
So, Laura, as you think about your intellectual beginnings within these conservative spaces, what drew you to those conservative academic spaces at the very beginning? You know, that's kind of an intentional and somewhat of a costly choice within academia to go into those spaces. So what gave you a sense of life or curiosity or warmth for those spaces? What drew you into conservative political philosophy? What was the appeal?
I mean, for me, I joke in the book a bit about getting red-pilled by Plato. The red pill experience being this thing where you just sort of see through all the lies around you and the state operations, right, and the liberal pieties, and that's used on the sort of alt-right, or what used to be the alt-right. So I kind of joke about that, but there's also just a real truth to that. So that was one dimension of it, where you're reading Plato, and Plato, you know, writing 4th century BCE, a long time ago, but he's got this diagnosis of democracy and the sort of pathologies of living within a democracy and the way people think about democracy. And I thought that was incredible because I was in my 3rd or 4th year of university when I took this, and it really was very accurate in my, there's just a lot. Plato's astounding in his prescience and his understanding of human psychology.
So, I mean, just for our listeners, what are the core critiques that Plato offers of democracy? Like, what's he saying?
It's been a long time since I've thought about it. I mean, I can say something about that, but I also want to say partly what it was is that I had these amazing professors. Okay, so they gave these very, formal lectures that were very well crafted. They drew you into the books, and they appreciated the books, not just as something to sort of tear down and critique, but to say, this is something that is really rich. You might learn from, you might understand yourself, right? If you talk about, it's not my professors, it's Plato and Socrates who are so gripping. And, Socrates is all about knowing thyself, right? But for that, in Plato, what that means is part of what you have to do to understand yourself is understand the culture you're sitting in, right? And to have a deep understanding of that and to question a lot of that. And so my professors were really good at questioning everything. And that's the kind of angle of philosophy that is not just unique to the weird Straussian world. I mean, it's critical thought, and like critical thinking, but this one had a different inflection. It was about self-knowledge, knowledge of the soul, the spirit, how your political regime shapes your spirit and shapes the ways in which you think about things. And so the critique of democracy is like bound up in the structure of the soul as Plato outlines it. And it's about equality. In different regimes, the rulers are ruled by different parts of themselves, and then in Platonic psychology. And in a democracy, we're governed by the many, right? It's a very elitist conception, the many, and the many are driven by their everyday desires, right? Their sort of bodily desires and their greed. And that's the Platonic psychology. There are some famous passages in the Republic where they critique democracy, but I think there's also a little bit of love of democracy in there, because democracy is like this technicolor world where all opinions are treated equal. And that is a pathology because it destroys judgment, but it's also somewhere where you can have some freedom. But the thing that really got me, I mean, I remember I wanted to be a doctor in my first few years of graduate school and go and like be part of Doctors Without Borders. And then there was this critique of democracy. The critique there is that democracies are overrun by lawyers and doctors because people take such poor care of themselves because they're driven by their desires. So they have no sort of self-control. So they're just Epicureans, running around serving the base desires, and that creates terrible health. And then they're always suing each other all the time. So you need all these advocates, and so there's no virtue is the kind of ancient way of thinking about it. And I thought, man, that's true. We are obsessed with health in our democracy. The lawyers and doctors are honored, right? Because of these like sicknesses in our culture. And I thought, I don't know. I then dropped out of my organic chemistry course that year, which was very convenient because that's a very brutal course. So it was all of that, but it was also the beauty of the works. There was part of me that was also just, I loved literature. I always loved writing. I loved thinking. I love Rousseau and Nietzsche. I love so many parts of this tradition. And I'm really sad about, part of the book, as you've seen, is trying to reconcile some of that with the fact that I love comparative literature, right? I love the wealth of different traditions that can be taken seriously. And I'm not anti-woke. So it's complicated.
Yeah, so let's get into what you don't love about these figures and this movement. I think oftentimes when we think about Trumpian figures and the intellectual new right, we think of them as being anti-liberal, illiberal. Basically, they're against what we call liberalism today. And obviously, that's a contested word. Can you maybe define for us what liberalism is for our listeners? And then tell us a little bit about what bothers these thinkers so much about the liberal idea, because sometimes they seem to hate it. And even the title of your book, I think, is illustrative. It's called Furious Minds. And to think of a mind as being furious, that's a very evocative image. They're angry about something, and presumably they're angry for legitimate reasons. And I think there's a danger of dismissing them as being crazy, bad, evil. But some of these people are actually well-intentioned. Some of these people actually think they're doing God's work, sometimes quite literally.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it raises a question that we're often interested in here on Zealots at the Gate. I mean, our podcast is called Zealots at the Gate, so we find zealots fascinating. But I think one recurring theme is, how do otherwise brilliant people or well-intentioned people support bad things?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I saw a lot of in your book, that they start out with legitimate critiques, they start off with legitimate insights, but then they go totally like off the rocker. They just kind of lose themselves in this kind of passion and this zealotry.
All right, Shadi, but you gave her like 7 things there. So like start with, what is liberalism and what are their core complaints about liberalism? Like how would you define what their fight is?
Okay, I want to just say a couple things, though. I mean, I think that one way to think about this is just that Trump kind of gives camouflage to the ideologues, because he's not very ideological. And so this sort of thing has almost grown up without people seeing it very clearly, partly because he's sort of playing it's not like he's intentionally doing a cover-up, obviously, right? But it's like this whole thing has emerged. And so I just want to be clear, I don't think Trump is sort of caught up in this. So what is liberalism? I think there's a couple of different ways, obviously, to think about this. One of the reasons I was drawn to political philosophy is because it felt like it gave you this explanation of the whole history of the world, right? Like you could see the ideas operating through time. And so I think in thinking about liberalism, it can be helpful to think about what it emerged out of. So we're talking about, religious conflagrations, wars during the Middle Ages, and scholasticism, and a narrow-minded, sometimes totalizing way of thinking, right, is at least how some of these early moderns thought about it. Whether that was fair is another question. But so liberalism emerges in this time of incredible conflict. So you have people like Hobbes and Locke, Francis Bacon, and there's the Renaissance, and you have this discovery of all these ancient books. So part of what they wanted to do is create space for different ways of thinking, right, and for contestation. And they wanted to have a different kind of politics, or the possibility of a different kind of politics, which would allow, again, different ways of life to operate against one another, and in the very least, sort of toleration for different religious outlooks. And so one way to think about this that the Straussians are fond of is that the moderns were building on low but solid ground. And so shifting attention away from all the questions that people will go to die for, right? About whether it's the Trinity or who's going to rule over whom from what religion. The moderns were thinking, if we can turn down the temperature and found a different kind of political order, then that will be good for human flourishing. And so part of that involves liberal institution building built on consent of the governed. If you think about Thomas Hobbes, we actually just need to all agree that life is nasty, brutish, and short. And so get together to build a very basic state structure, agree that who the sovereign's going to be, and just go from there. So anyway, that's sort of the origin story of liberalism. But what I think is it's useful to just talk about limited government, rights, freedom, spheres of freedom, civil rights, free press, and sort of structures of government that protect individual rights and freedoms and are characterized by the separation of powers and so those institutions that are neutral with regard to the good life. It's liberalism also born against the background of incredible hierarchies that seemed quite unjust. And so what they hate about it is, if we think about the current context, looking at the outcome of a lot of that, especially in the last 50 years here in the United States, you've got an incredible social dynamism that is very upsetting to old hierarchies. If you can tell the story of America, that's part of it. And part of it's just the uncertainty that also fosters, right? Because over the course of time, you lose a lot of traditions. I think there's maybe failures within liberalism that we could identify, but if I'm just going to try to give a brief answer, it's I think a lot of discomfort with the last 50 years of social change and the loss of status that's brought to certain demographics, right? And that they're feeling alienated from what's new, and just a whole lot of uncertainty, moral uncertainty, and the loss of a lot of traditions and sense of community. The sort of most succinct version of this is probably Patrick Deneen's 2018 book, Why Liberalism Failed, where he's sort of identifying liberal individualism and autonomy as the sort of wrecking ball of liberalism, that the more individualized, he calls it the individualist anthropology, and says that because liberalism is built on that concern for the individual and individual autonomy, it tends to eat away at our family structures, at our community structures, at all the intermediary institutions that people need to flourish and thrive. And that's obviously quite compelling, right? And then what you get as a result is the state growing in power and the need for a strong man to exert authority. There's also a rich thing there theologically, where a lot of these guys think that liberalism undermines the natural order, right? That with all of this autonomy that people have, they no longer know how to structure their lives, and all of this choice leads to a abandonment of the net. I mean, I think when they're talking about it, they're thinking about homosexuality a lot of the time, and they're thinking about women and abortion, that people are too empowered to not follow the natural order of things, and that undermines all kinds of things as well.
And to what extent do you think some of those concerns are legitimate? Because I think there's much to say for that diagnosis, right? Maybe less so on the women homosexuality part, but on the broader claim that we're overwhelmed by choice, where everything is individualized, so we don't have structure that constrains us. We don't know how to live a good life. We don't know where to find meaning and belonging. A lot of us are unhappy. There's a crisis of loneliness,
anxiety, depression, emptiness.
Yeah, I agree with all of it as one thing we're confronting. I get my backup because I think they're really failing to do justice to the possibilities within liberalism, for one thing, and their historical account of how necessary this is and is, I think, very flawed. But I think that the diagnosis of something is, I guess I think they're also very dystopian, and it's a lot of sort of apocalyptic talk. And there's a lot that's good in the world. I think one part of the problem in terms of even just the diagnosis is that liberals and sort of people in America, for all kinds of reasons having to do with the history of liberalism, struggle to talk about the good and the good life, right? And don't have much experience doing that, and don't have much experience having serious exposure to different ways of life that in a rigorous way. And so I think a lot of people are living quite good lives, right? Probably, I mean, these guys would say, yeah, the liberal elites are, but they won't say, they also say that they're terrible decadent lives. And I don't think that's true. I think that there's a lot of sort of wholesome, good living happening. That's very good. I mean, it's not their version of the good life, and there are many plural versions of this, but I think there's a lot of people who are living quite well, but they're not really talking about it for all kinds of good reasons. And I think it's still true that that's a failure, and there's a failure to be deliberate about things. And so I think there's a lot of problems, but I also really want to push back against the sort of dire diagnosis, because there's also been so much good. The social progress has been really good, even if there are problems and there are people who have been affected badly by that we should recognize and try to do better. But I don't like the tenor of it. Really upsets me.
What would you say is the intellectual seduction of these ideas? What's fun about being a part of the intellectual right?
Well, part of it's just the sort of transgressiveness, right? I mean, another part of the diagnosis, I would say, is this sort of stultifying groupthink that often dominates in some of our spaces.
In left-wing spaces.
Yes. Left-wing spaces.
Mainstream
Centrist spaces maybe even more, right? I don't know,
Yeah.
right? But it's like, that seems like something that we can all recognize.
So it's fun to be transgressive.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Very. And then you feel very smart, and you can go around making fun of people. But I think it's also deeper. It's exciting to also ask all of these questions. I mean, I think when you're young, that can go a long ways, right? Just asking questions and being transgressive. They are also filling that vacuum that we're sort of describing, which again, I don't think is a total vacuum. Like a lot of my liberal friends, they're reading good books and reading novels and they're going to church. Like there's a lot of, good stuff out there that people are doing. But there's also, I think, this problem of community and alienation. And those aren't like necessarily mainstream, all of the wholesome things I'm describing. I don't think it's happening in our colleges very much and in our universities as much as it could be. And so you've got this problem in liberal democracies of meaning and of authority and of sort of formation, I guess is what I in the book, I sort of talk a little bit about higher education and how they're exploiting these vulnerabilities in our higher education. And they're coming along. Liberalism won't provide you answers. It's not going to tell you how to live your life. And they're coming along and they're saying, oh, we will. We've got some answers for you. We've got, 5 different models of how to be a serious Calvinist or a serious Catholic, serious Plato scholar or a Straussian. And they are doing YouTube videos about the great books. Even the Bronze Age Pervert, his podcast, he talks about classical music. I only listened to as much of that stuff as I needed to. They're telling young men, go to the gym, right? You've got Jordan Peterson out there providing something that people are obviously excited about. And so I think the contrast there with what even, a good liberal arts education provides is quite dramatic.
So you mentioned Bronze Age Pervert. I just want to dwell on him for a moment because he may not be familiar to much of our audience. Can you just, in a very short summary, what does he stand for? Who is he? Why is he important? And what does he believe in?
Yeah. In the book, I talk about some of the, I guess, mainstream groups on the New Right, and there's a whole catalog of them. But I also talk about the hard right, which is constituted by a bunch of different figures who are pretty openly fascist or misogynist or just have like some really brutal rhetoric. And Bronze Age Pervert is in that category. His real name is Costin Alamariu, and he's got a PhD from Yale in political philosophy. So my same zone. Like I do know the people he studied with. And when he was finishing his PhD, he was also sort of creating this online persona of Bronze Age Pervert with a podcast and big Twitter account. And then he wrote a book called Bronze Age Mindset. And it's a pseudo-Nietzschean sort of tract, this 4-part thing that's like, thus spoke Zarathustra, but it's basically this aggressive critique of everything that's sort of mainstream, and he calls it the Longhouse, which is this sort of matriarchal taking over of all of our institutions through wokeness and all of the rest of it. So it's really misogynist, hating women. And then he's also posting all the time. He's traveling the world posting with his bodybuilding, and it's super racist. So just really gross stuff. And he openly admits to being a fascist. He's Jewish. His family's from Romania. He's also very funny. And he's quite smart. So he's got a pretty big following. I think right now he's more sort of living some cosmopolitan life. But I also I can't stand it. It's impossible to do justice to just how awful it is too. And violent.
There is sort of an aesthetic. It's not sort of purely intellectual
oh
ideas.
God, no! It's all aesthetic.
A slight pivot here. I am curious. It seems to me, obviously, you have a real critique of those on the right, but I wonder. For Democrats who are, hopefully doing some soul searching in, after their losses in 2016 and 2024, there does seem to be some misunderstandings of what's going on the right, or just sort of a lack of understanding, or sort of a belief that those on the right are just stupid and mean. So I'm wondering if you could kind of help us, think through the ways in which the left has misread their opponents over the last 10 years, and how your book might help them better understand those on the right.
Well, everybody's talking very different languages, right? And so it's very frustrating as someone who's been watching this new right movement sort of boil up and I think have a tremendous amount of impact. Shockingly, some pretty freakish ideas, but the rise of the manosphere sort of happening in tandem, along, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel being caught up in all this, and their ascension has been incredible. And you see the Democrats not seeing it, not understanding it, not having anything to say back to it. And also at the same time, just the constant infighting. And then and even now we're a year in and it's still just, it seems very just like feckless doesn't quite describe what we're looking at. And so it's perplexing and disheartening. And it's like, it's hard to describe. Right. In terms of what they've misunderstood, I also am very sympathetic to the misunderstanding because it's hard to take this stuff seriously. It's surprising that they've had so much power. But I think it's a real sign of just the complacency, of the comfort of American life. I think that they've misunderstood the psychological engine driving a lot of this. And so we can talk about economic policy and the, hollowing out of the Rust Belt. There has been a lot of attention given to that. There's been a lot of attention given to the racial motives. And I mean, it's kind of hard these days to underestimate some of that, right? Given how things are going. And the misogyny, I think, is part of it. But I think part of what's happening too is that these people I write about are far more extreme than the American public. And even than the MAGA voters. I think that that's part of what I wanted to do with my book, is to show how extreme some of the stuff at the top is, because I think it's quite disconnected from even what's driving a lot of MAGA voters. So it's hugely complicated. But I think the psychological drives, part of it is just this deep discontent and feeling of alienation that does sort of unite many different factions of MAGA.
So I hear you all there. I wonder, like a gentle push on you here would be something like, should we be surprised by the rise of this? Should we be surprised that in an age of loneliness, intense mobility, massive migration, huge amounts of change and social flux and hierarchy, should we really be surprised by this reaction and by this longing for order, for meaning, for belonging, for a longing for strength, for a strong man? Should we really be surprised? And is it not the case that Democrats and liberals have really been truly out of touch with this sense of longing, and out of touch in profound ways with just sort of talking over the real pain and longing of a huge swath of the American public?
Yeah, I think that you put it better than I did. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that just has to be acknowledged. And that was true in 2016, but I think in 2024, it was just, I have some friends or people I know who would say, I don't have a clue how anybody could vote for Donald Trump a second time, especially after January 6th, right? And that's not how I feel. Mm-hmm. I think by the time we had Biden hold out that long, and I think that was just absolutely shameful. And then we had to watch we had to watch that, and then Kamala. I have nothing against Kamala personally. It's fine. She's fine. I like her. I would love to meet her, but I mean, it was just not impressive, right? What happened to the Democrats. And by the time all of that happened, I thought, oh my God, no, I get it now. And they didn't talk about they didn't understand inflation. They didn't even admit that it had been a problem. And Biden didn't give press conferences. I mean, all of it was just shameful.
Man.
I absolutely understand. I would never vote for Trump. Nobody has more Trump derangement syndrome than me. But still, I just think the way you put it is absolutely right. Okay. But I don't believe in the inevitability of any of it. And I'm still genuinely perplexed by their out of touchness.
Yeah. One of the core identities of liberalism, as you said, is a sense of limited government and allowing for sort of a pluralism of values. And belief systems and ways of life, that is a core value of Western liberalism. And then as the narrative goes, it's, Christian conservatives or the hard right that is looking to impose morality through the federal government. And my push or my challenge is this, that for those of my friends on the Christian right, we would say, well, hang on a minute. The left has been pushing a morality through the federal government for the past 50 years. That through public schools and legislation and all kinds of government programs, the left has been pushing their morality through the federal government for 50 years. And the hard right is simply saying, well, okay, we're going to do the same thing. We are going to take the state and we are going to impose our morality on the nation. And so it's basically both sides have become illiberal in this sense. And I mean, I literally just said both sides. So, I mean, whataboutism is,
No, but there's
happening
something,
at this moment. But
I think there's a real critique there. No, I understand that. I do too. But if I'm going to do the defensive answer, I'd say we got to look at the specifics of what that means. What are the liberals actually imposing, right? Are they imposing, they're imposing pronouns and they're imposing like equal rights or like, desegregation? Like, what are we talking about? And let's talk about whether that's legitimate or not in a free society, or whether that amounts to a kind of forced indoctrination. Are we talking about and is it secularism in the schools and not having prayer allowed? What does that mean, and what would be appropriate? And to say a lot of that might have been legitimate in a free society to keep things neutral. On the other hand, I think that there's some legitimacy to that critique, and it hasn't been neutral. It's been secular, right? It's been a kind of secular enforcement, and that might be appropriate because of the Constitution and because of our history, but what are the limits of that? And also maybe did that go too far in some instances? And is there a way through it now to open things up more while also respecting individuals in a genuinely liberal way and accommodating the differences? And I think that there's some one of the strongest critiques is that the new right has is what you've described, that it pretends to be neutral, but in fact, liberalism is not only not neutral, it's illiberal, and it's failed to be pluralist in any genuine sense, and in a deep sense, because it's shaping souls too. And so they could even say, we can't even live within the society. We cannot preserve our traditions because the overwhelming culture is so aggressively opposed to us and so unaccommodating. And I think that critique, I think there's quite a bit to it, and that something has to change within liberalism and among liberals to become better at being truly liberal. And do you guys know the Alex Lefebvre?
Yeah, Liberalism as a Way of Life, his book.
Have you spoken with him?
I have before. It's quite good. It's
quite good, and it's good on this stuff, and I think he's a great person to sort of think about this stuff with. But I get touchy about it too, because my husband grew up in Kansas, and he's not a very pious person at all. But he was surrounded by a lot of religion growing up, and I think he felt pretty alienated by a lot of that, and like it was forced upon people by the culture. And there's plenty of places in this country where atheists are the ones persecuted, right? Or non-believers or alien, they get ostracized for religious reasons. There are plenty of places where that's the reality, not the woke whatever. So, you have to. It's very tricky. It's very regional, and it's very it might just be the super elite universities that do shape a lot, have a huge amount of influence. But this problem is very complicated.
Yeah. So we've mentioned the word secularism a couple times. So I wanted to maybe just dive into the religious nature of the new right a little bit more, or the lack thereof of religion. And I think most of the figures you talk about don't seem particularly pious. They might be religious in a kind of superficial sense, like they say that they appreciate and love Christian values.
Yeah.
There's the post-liberals and the Catholic integralists who are more religious, and that's a particular group. But when we're talking about Trumpism, it seems almost like neo-pagan. It seems like Trump is the most secular president we've had in American history. He's someone who is, in his very bones, everything about him seems antithetical to the religious sensibility. So there's a kind of paradox here that many of the people who defend Trump talk about Christian civilization and Christian values, but there doesn't seem to be anything particularly Christ-like about the new right. Even what you said earlier, they take pleasure in making fun of people. They like being transgressive for the sake of it. They're misogynist. They don't have respect for the weak or the destitute. There's no sense of empathy. All of these things are things that we would associate, I think, with Christianity. Yet here's a movement that claims to be aligned with Christianity. Can you just help us make sense of that paradox a little bit?
It's true that a lot of the people I write about don't seem very pious, and I think that a lot of what you describe is accurate. But I think that there is a unity of agreement here that rejects not just secularism, but just this idea. I think that one of the things I was surprised by is almost how anti-modern they almost all are, insofar as they really, even if as just a practical political point in there, like how they think about politics, they do believe that you need a foundation of transcendental belief. They disagree about what that is amongst themselves, but there's a kind of belief that in the society as a whole, you do need a transcendental belief system to be operative.
Yeah,
and
you need a foundation.
You need a foundation. It's like this whole debate about foundationalism. They all agree with that, and many of them are very pious too, and are clearly driven by, I'd say, almost a majority of the figures, but they don't wear that on their sleeve so much because they're talking about politics, and it's much more that we need this transcendental belief system, and this is the fallout from that. But you do have like Yoram Hazony, you have all the post-liberals, and even the Claremont guys. They're kind of Christian nationalists now. But yes, in terms of the Trump paradox, there's the intellectual dimension of it, where it's a more sort of abstract commitment to religion as part of politics, versus there are other parts of MAGA where religion is a big driver, right? The Christian right has kind of come along to join up with Trump. And I write about the New Apostolic Reformation, where it's not transactional there. It's like with my guys, it's kind of like they see him as a vehicle. They don't care about him. They're not pious towards Trump, but I think there are a lot of parts of it. There's this whole part of MAGA that talks about him, that prophesies about Trump. There's like the Cyrus anointing, this belief that sometimes God anoints a wrecking ball, and so that there's a kind of more serious, like less transactional dimension to the Christian connection to Trump. So that's not exactly how the people I write about think about it. They're more into like, no, we got to restore the Christian nation. Trump's going to be our guy, and then Vance hopefully will be the real, inheritor of that triumph.
Yeah, it is interesting to me, Laura, that in your book you speak a lot about the Catholics, and that the evangelicals and the Pentecostals don't get a lot of discussion. And I think because you're focusing on academia and the intellectual world, and honestly, evangelicals and Pentecostals who are supporting Trump, it is not out of like a deep political philosophy or political theory. It is a much more emotive, cultural, tribal sort of thing. There's not a lot like a rich theological system for evangelical support of Trump.
Yeah,
it is more experiential in that kind of way. So it is a fascinating thing to watch my fellow evangelicals who have been skeptical of Catholicism, sort of.
Right. It's like a lot of the people are Catholic. There's like the Catholic sort of holding hands with the Pentecostals. It's very. I had to learn about a lot of this because I don't have much background in just how this all works. And I found it just fascinating to try to unpack the different parts of this and how the different groups think about it.
Yeah.
But because they're thinking about it as political thinkers, and how sort of, I think their thinking is, well, this is what Christianity would need to thrive.
So Laura, whither liberalism? Where should liberalism go? What does liberalism, what does its future look like? Does it need to become thicker, like morally thicker? Does it need its own foundation? Does it need its own moral community that contests the moral community of the new right? Or does it need to double down on a sort of thin liberalism of just limited state, limited government, individual rights, individual freedoms? Should it just double down on being thin secular liberalism, or become thick?
That's so perfectly articulated. I think it has to do both things at once, which is very difficult. And I wrote a review of Alex Lefebvre's book, that I might send you, and then you could put it in the program notes, because I'm not like a liberal theorist, so this again is like I'm coming around. I'm trying to learn, my roles and talk about this stuff. But I think that you need to, on the one hand, you do need to become more deliberate about what it means to live as a liberal, and you have to liberals have to become more deliberate about community and about and learn to have like hard conversations and learn about civics, and they need a better educational formation. I mean everybody needs that, and so that's kind of where I end the book, because I care about higher education, and I think our education system has been too tilted towards a kind of critical thought and deconstruction, and so we need a sort of humanistic renaissance that would also involve education in religion and various religions, but it would be plural. Like, it's not simple. So I think that liberals need to become more deliberate about these things and to become more conversant in the good life, because that's what I think liberalism demands, that, and it demands a kind of moral seriousness. But I think at the same time, there has to be a genuine doubling down on political liberalism, right? Which is this idea that the state is neutral with respect to individual conceptions of the good life. And that means becoming quite more accommodationist towards people who we strongly disagree with. But it's difficult because we also have to be respectful of individuals as liberals.
So we should accommodate Trump supporters and the New Right more.
Partly, I think so. I mean, I think that they have to accommodate serious religious people.
Yeah.
And religious conversations, and maybe religion in public life. I'm not sure about public schools, how that should play out, but I think having non-denominational prayer time or whatever, it's just that I worry about places where it's so dominant by one group that ends up being oppressive to non-believers or to people with different faiths. So I think those questions are very like tangible and important, but I wish there was more space for sort of, I guess, I don't want to be flaky, but like spirituality in our public life. I think that could be really healthy, but it's difficult to achieve that.
I'll show my cards a little more here. Like I'm not so sanguine or optimistic about liberalism's prospects moving forward. I think it does need more thickness, but I think it's going to get pinched not only from the right but from the left. I feel like Bernie Sanders and AOC, the socialists provide a more vibrant vision of the good life that is more attractive. It's more energetic.
Yeah.
They provide a vision of the good life and the good city and what it means to be a part of this movement. And so I think that in order for liberalism to have a future, it's going to have to be morally thick liberal communities that come from actually diverse.
Do you think that that's what they're offering? Because I sort of do. I mean, I don't know that they're illiberal because they have because of the socialist economic policies. But I don't know. I think that some of it, there's like the excesses of wokeness. I don't know if, right, that doesn't seem to be Bernie and AOC's problem in a way, but maybe it is. Or I guess, what do you think? Because I agree, there's a lot of energy there and there's something good about it. Or I think there is.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think wokeness and Bernie Sanders are two different challenges. But I think that for Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mamdani, what is illiberal about them is the size and scope of the state.
Yeah, okay.
And I think for wokeness, what is illiberal is just the use of institutional power to suppress diverse thought and speech.
This is where I would maybe disagree. I don't necessarily see a strong government or government interventionism in the economic realm as being inherently illiberal. I think that it's liberals don't always have to be about small government. There are versions of liberalism that can have a more expansive state, and actually most liberal states in the world do have expansive, generous welfare states, especially in Europe, obviously, Western Europe. So I think that I wouldn't go so far as to call Bernie and Zoran illiberal. Maybe they're post-liberal, or maybe they're reimagining liberalism in a way that is more socialist, and that's a distinctive thing that they're offering.
Yeah, well, that's where you're wrong, Shadi. I just think that a large a large state by necessity begins to endanger individual freedom, that it's unsustainable to protecting individual freedom. The larger the state gets, that it gets into an intention, sort of tension on that issue. But, we can fight about that some other time when Laura's not here. And
No, I think I don't have like a firm opinion. I think I don't think that they're going to achieve a national strong state. And I think that in some states they should have a strong, I don't mind, I think that's the local experiments in different states is good. I think that I have no problem with Mamdani doing this in New York. Even if they were to totally succeed and what does Bernie actually want? Universal health care. And I don't know. I'm not good at parsing all that, but I tend to agree with Shadi that the coercive element, there can be a pretty non-coercive big state, at least, or what I care more about is the sort of spiritual coercion than the economic stuff. But that's, we'd have to I'd have to study for that conversation.
Yeah, so as we begin to close up, I want to return to one of the original questions that we were sort of touching on, which is the question of whether otherwise good people, otherwise well-intentioned people can support evil things. And I'm just curious, like you've followed these folks for a few years now and really dived into their writings and their speeches and all of that. Should we? I guess one question is, especially people with so-called Trump derangement syndrome, they try to keep Trump supporters at arm's length. They don't want to be friends with Trump supporters. They want to keep their distance because these people are ultimately bad or deplorable. And I couldn't really tell. In your book, I sort of got two senses of this. You occasionally were sympathetic with some of the diagnosis that these Trump-adjacent figures were offering, but you also felt kind of disgusted by them sometimes, if I can use that word.
Yeah, sure.
I wonder in your own life to what extent you would feel comfortable befriending people who have these views. Do you think there's room for deep friendship with people who support terrible things that you find personally frightening?
That's a good question. I think the more you learn about someone and engage with certain things, I think that part of being serious is allowing yourself to judge some of that, right? And so I try to go in with openness. And I think some of the people in the book I do like I've been around them, and I think I don't think they're evil. I don't know that I want to be friends with almost any of them because I do thoroughly reject a lot of this, and I have lost friends right through all of this. So. And I haven't tried, not necessarily because it's been a big break, an open break, but because I'm not reaching out to these guys, right? But part of it's like personal, like old friendships lost. It doesn't mean I couldn't be friends with somebody who's in it, who's new, right? Who I don't know very well.
But as soon as you get to know them, it falls apart, huh?
Well, I have some friends who'd say they'll never lose a friendship over politics, right? And I don't agree with that. I don't think you have to be friends with people who hold views that you find repulsive. But I think that there's plenty of territory in this gray zone, right? Where people maybe aren't so sure, or you don't really know. And I guess the point I want to make about the psychology is I do think almost all of them think they're doing the right thing and that they're acting well. There's something perverse about that, and I think they're often wrong, and it's jumbled up with greed and like power seeking. But I'm sort of Aristotelian in how I think about the human spirit, right? And that we're all seeking the good, even if we're very mistaken about that, or even if that conception of the good is completely bizarre to me. So I do think there's something there that's probably true of most of the actors I write about. I don't know. It's very difficult to actually think through the actual people and the ones I know.
I think it is a really tough question about where we draw the line on friendship. But it makes me a little bit nervous to think if we say that we can't be friends with, or that it's very difficult to be friends with Trump supporters.
I would not say that about Trump supporters.
Oh,
I want to
supporters.
say
Okay, you're talking more about
the problem is I've written this book. I've read a lot of what these people think. I used to be friends with some of them, and I don't want to be friends with them anymore. And I'm caught up in its partisan. But not at all with Trump supporters. I wouldn't feel that way.
That's different.
Like general, that's quite different. And I want to know all the people, right? You want to talk to people. You want to get to know people. You want to understand how they're thinking. And I think that so that's something quite different, And I'm still very curious about a lot of the characters I write about. When you're asking about specifics, then it's kind of personal.
So I guess the question there would be, how did they lose their way? Because you said that you think most of them are seeking the good. They think they're acting well. What broke them? What led them to support these repulsive things?
I mean, a lot of it, I think, with the people I'm writing about, it's an experience of that exclusion and injustices in higher education. And part of it's also because there's a kind of, I mean, Kool-Aid isn't quite the right thing, but I think for people in these conservative circles and spaces, there's a formation that happens that's through these different institutions and a kind of insularity that comes from that because people aren't talking to them and they're not part of sort of mainstream academia, that then there becomes a kind of capture. Once you're in that, it's much easier to just go where it goes than to break free of it. And it went towards Trump in some of these instances.
We're responsible for the choices we make, but what would you say about the state of the academy in America, that it has produced this subculture, this underground subculture of academics? Is there something unhealthy at the core of American academia?
No, I mean, I don't mean to be sanguine again, but I think I might be. I mean, I think you have somebody get the presidency, right? Donald Trump wins the presidency. And anybody who's got the presidency is going to attract all kinds of people to sort of buttress his project. And there were a lot of people who saw in academia, and it's a free society, you're going to have people who share those beliefs, and there were people there thinking, oh, he's our guy, he stands for what I stand for, and there are enough reasons for that there were enough crises, there was enough that was appealing about him. There were whole parts of the conservative world that were bound up in this stuff. So there were people ready and waiting. I don't think that's a sign of sickness. I mean, even Bronze Age pervert, I mean, you're going to graduate a few fascists in a free society. You don't know that ahead of time, but what are you going to do, right? You're going to have some Marxists. That's a free society. I don't think that's the sign of rot. I think that there are big problems in academia. There are failures. There's a kind of corporate mindset that I think is dumb and is failing our young people. So there are plenty of problems, but I think that, and conservatives are to blame for these factions that have arisen, because they've never, for 50 years, they've been griping about the civil rights and women. I mean, at a certain point, they lose respect for that, and it becomes insular. So
yeah. So my last question is just one that's been curious to me, and it has to do with how Donald Trump became the way he is. And it does seem to me like your narrative is that the intellectuals followed after him, as opposed to, I'm thinking of when he came down that escalator and announced he was running for presidency in 2016. How many of these ideas did he have in his head? What was influencing him at that moment?
Yeah.
Surely he wasn't reading Strauss.
No. I think what was interesting is he intuited so many things, and he also intuited like the fringe of American conservatism and sort of the paleo-conservative worldview without necessarily being aware of any of that. And so he had these connections to the evangelical world, but I think he is an intuitive politician. But there were, I was surprised in my research to find that, Michael Anton and some of these other figures who were very early in defending him, even during the 2016, starting at the beginning of the year, writing in this pseudonymous blog. And they were quite steeped in paleo-conservative thought, sort of particularist, sometimes Southern agrarian, anti-foreign involvement, nativist, right, strand of conservatism. And Anton calls himself a Paleo-Straussian. That's very bizarre. So that was all not, that was new. They were steeped in that, and they saw Trump and they said, "You're what we want." And because you represent that, it's like Rush Limbaugh stuff, but that has an intellectual tradition. And so they were already sort of well versed in Sam Francis and some of these other thinkers. And so they were able to very quickly say, okay, you represent economic nationalism, secure borders, and America First foreign policy. That's all that there's a real continuity there with these intellectual traditions. So he didn't have those ideas. I don't think he has a clue. Still, probably, right? But they were there. They were sort of sitting there in the broader conservative world.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Laura, thank you so much for making time for us and for this conversation. Thank you as well for this book. And thank you for, allowing me to poke and prod a little bit.
It's great to talk with you both. It seems like you guys are asking really good questions, and so I'm going to have to become a listener, I think.
There we go. Hey, we got one more. That's fantastic. Well, friends, we thank you for listening to Zealots at the Gate. If you like what you heard, please check out the other episodes. There's a whole library of them at comment.org.
And we want to hear from you. Email us at zealots@comment.org, and be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine. It's produced by Rachel Collins. Technical production is by Allie Crummy. Audience strategy is by Matt Crummy. And editorial direction by Ann Snyder.
I'm Shadi Hamid.
And I'm Matthew Kamink. Thank you for joining us.